Good evening. Let me see. That was my test. Am I on? Okay. All right. And before we begin, I'm going to open up in prayer. Father, I thank you so much for the privileges to preach your word, Lord. Father, tonight, please help me to bring your divine wisdom and your knowledge to a heart that needs it here, Father. And if there is someone here who doesn't know you as their Savior, Lord, please have your gospel be presented tonight through this message so that they can understand that that is first and foremost in their lives, Lord, before anything else applies from here, Father. I thank you and I praise you. Amen. All right, so tonight we're gonna read from the book of Ruth. We're gonna be in chapter 1. And I know that all good preachers open up with a good story, but I'm not that interesting. But yesterday I did go out with an interesting guy, so I went out with Matt McDonald. And I told him, before I went, I said, Matt, I need a good sermon illustration. So he threw a trailer on my foot and broke my toe. And I said, thank you. But no, in all honesty, though, it was one of those times where the unexpected happened. The parking brake went out when we were pulling the trailer off. We had borrowed it from John, so we had his big snow machine trailer. The parking brake failed, and so we had to figure out how to get on there because it was high center sitting on the back of the trailer. So we're looking at it, and between he and I, we figured we had more brawn than brains, so we thought, we'll just pick it up. So we decided to pick up the trailer, and it worked, and as we got it off, though, Matt hit the gas, and it bumped a bit and fell off and smashed my toe. But the short story is Matt looked at me and said, we're still going to hike, right? And I said, okay. So, but let's go as far as we can on the four-wheeler. But it was an unexpected event. But we're going to start reading from Ruth chapter 1. And we're going to read all the way through. I know it looks like it's going to be a very long sermon if we do that. But we're going to look and highlight a few of the words in here. And the book of Ruth is amazing because it's one of those books where you get to see the subtle divineness of God and his divine acting in your life. And we get to see that through the life of Ruth and Naomi and her family. We're going to start in verse 1. It says, Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the name of his 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they came into the country of Moab, and continued there. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left, and her 2 sons. And they took them wives of the women of Moab, and the name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelled there about 10 years. And Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them. And the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the country of Moab how that the Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. Wherefore she went forth out of that place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her. And they went on the way to return unto the land of Judah. And Naomi said unto her daughters-in-law, Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as ye have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant you that ye may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voice and wept. And they said unto her, Surely we will return with thee unto thy people. And Naomi said, Turn again, my daughters. Why will ye go with me? Are there yet any more sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn again, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say, I have hope, if I should say, have a husband also tonight, and should also bear sons, would ye tarry for them till they were grown? Of course, this is a rhetorical question Naomi's asking. Of course, they're not going to stay until she has her children grown where they can marry them again. Would ye stay for them from having husbands? Nay, my daughters, for it grieveth me much for your sakes, that the hand of the Lord is gone out against me. And they lifted up their voice and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave unto her. And she said, Behold, thy sister-in-law is gone back unto her people and unto her gods. Return thou after thy sister-in-law. And Ruth said, Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Of course, this is not the point of the message tonight, but that's an excellent verse that shows what salvation should look like. Where thou diest, will I die, and there there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me. When she saw that she was steadfastly minded to go with her, then she left speaking unto her. So they too went until they came to Bethlehem. And it came to pass when they were come to Bethlehem that all the city was moved about them. And they said, Is this Naomi? And she said unto them, Call me not Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me home again empty. Why then call ye me Naomi, seeing the Lord hath testified against me, and the Almighty hath afflicted me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, which returned out of the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of the barley harvest. So the book of Naomi is wonderful because, like I said, it's the subtlety of God's divine hand in a believer's life. This is what it looks like when you're out living your life and God is moving and doing things as He always does. It's not overtly present. It doesn't say, "Thus saith the Lord, thus will you do this." He's not telling them directly what to do. Instead, these are people just living life as you live life. So Naomi is wonderful in that sense. But, of course, we could stop in verse 1 because if you flip just back a page maybe, and you look at the end of Judges, we see that it says in verse 1 of Ruth, Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And you look at how the book of Judges ends, the very last verse. In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. This was a time of, if you know the book of Judges, this is a time where the people's faith wavered up and down, up and down. God would come in after their faith would waver. He would step in, and He would chastise them. They would have famine, they would have war, and then their faith would come back again when they would see that they only could have God as their victor, not themselves. So the book of Ruth is during this time period where the faith is going up and down in the whole country. It's wavering. And Elimelech is no different. His faith is wavering. And we're going to look at a couple words here, so I want you to mark before we begin 4 words that we're going to look at. We're going to look at sojourn in verse 1. I don't know if you circle things in your Bibles. Continued in verse 2. Then in verse 20, we're going to look at bitter. And then we're going to look at harvest. And I know we could focus on Ruth and everything she did, but we're going to look at just this section here where we're going to look at how God chastises those who are His children. And there's different forms that God has. There's different kinds of chastisement. There's different kinds of way God acts in someone's life when they are turning away from Him. There's chastisement. Sorry, I'll back up on that. There's 2 ways that God will afflict you in your life. There's chastisement. Then there is going to be strengthening your faith by sending things in to test you, to push you, to make you stronger. We see that in the book of Job. But then there's chastisement where you've turned away. And God is trying to discipline you like a child to bring you back. And that's where Elimelech and his family are sitting. And so some other things we're going to talk about before we get into it is a meaning of the few words, because this is very important before we discuss this, is Bethlehem means house of bread. Elimelech means my God is king, and Mahlon means sick, and Kilion means pining. These are important things. Back in this time, it was important what you named your children. It meant something more than us today, where we sort of just name our kids what sounds good to our ear, and that's what we name them. Some of us still name them based on a purpose or an intention, but most of us don't. And so Mahlon and Kilion are named sick and pining. That's very revealing about what the relationship was with God when your children are named sick and pining. I don't know how they grew up and wondered, hey, Mom, why am I named sick? Like, what is that about? Why am I named pining? Like, you have an aching or for something? What was it? And so, but Elimelech, his name means my God is king. He knew God. He lived in Bethlehem, the house of bread. And that's what we're going to look at tonight is I guess you could call this sermon, Bread Doesn't Grow on Trees. Is God is providing the house of bread in Bethlehem. This is where His people are, His believers are. He has promised them that they will be fruitful. He has promised them that He will treat them as His children. And they're in the house of bread. But as you can see, He goes to Moab. Moab is not the place God wants you to be. He does not want you with the unbelievers. He does not want you with those who are against God. And yes, we're in the world, but we're not to be of the world. We're not supposed to be in Moab, full-time residents. And looking at Elimelech in verse 1, we see that the Bible tells us that he went to sojourn in the country of Moab. And so we're going to use Moab just as to bring it into a modern context of your life. What Moab is Moab is exactly what you're going after that's outside of God. That's what Moab is going to be. Because right now you sit in Bethlehem, you're in his house with his people. You're in here listening to his word. You're being provided what you need. But Moab exists outside, somewhere else. And each one of us has a Moab that we get drawn towards. Each one of us has something that we're desiring that's outside of God. And every believer, and I heard this recently when I was listening to a really good debate, was every unbeliever is just that. There's someone who's still desiring something more than they desire God. That's all they are. And your job is to step in and show them that truth and say why it is so important. But Elimelech, he's going to go through some suffering because he's designed a sojourn in the country of Moab. And there's 4 types of suffering you can go through. There's mental, physical, emotional, or spiritual suffering. We see them throughout Scripture. But this one says there's a famine. That'd be a physical type of suffering that's happening. And suffering is interesting because from a Christian perspective, suffering is something that we endure for a season, and we know in the end there's going to be eternal bliss with Jesus Christ. There's going to be that perfection, our new body. We're not going to exist here anymore and have to worry about the suffering that sin gives us. But to an unbeliever, this is where all their joy is. So suffering doesn't make sense. It doesn't make a bit of sense to them because this is where all their pleasure and their joy should be. So why would a God make suffering happen where there is temporary, where this is their permanence? This is where they put all their eggs, and suffering is here. So it doesn't make sense to them. They don't have that sense of reality or of eternity that follows after this. And Elimelech lost sight of that. He started looking at the carnal side of suffering. And so that's the first thing we're going to look at is the reason for suffering. Suffering is going to come in one of those ways, mental, physical, emotional, or spiritual. Everybody in this room has gone through suffering in one way or another like that. They've grieved for those they've lost. They've had emotional suffering from fatigue, from being pushed too much, being stressed. They get emotionally fatigued and suffer. There's spiritual suffering where you pull yourself away from God and you start to suffer the consequences. There's physical suffering where you may be poor. You may not have food to eat. That is a physical suffering. And all of us have been through that. Some of us more than others, it seems, but all of us have been through that. And so, regardless of the suffering you're having, whether it be like Elimelech that's going to be killed, or his sons who die, it doesn't matter what kind of suffering you're going through. It's all about your response that dictates everything. It's just your response. Don't get focused on the suffering that you're going through, the famine that's happening in your life right now, because it's your response that matters. That's all God is concerned about. Whether it be a chastisement, whether it be for strengthening you, your response should always be to stay focused on Bethlehem, to stay where the bread is, to not venture outside of there looking to fulfill that carnal side that's saying, go to Moab. Go to Moab and get the food you need. Go elsewhere and get what you need, what you desire. You say, what does that look like? Well, that looks like someone who is with the enemy more than they're with those of God. So you may come to church on Sunday and you may come on Wednesday, but you're in the enemy's camp all week long, and that's where you're most comfortable. You don't feel like you fit in with God's people. You still feel like you're more comfortable in the enemy's camp. And you say, well, I'm just going to be there all week, and I'm going to come back on Sunday. And then maybe not again on Wednesday. But let's see. Sojourning was Elimelech's plan. He was just going to be there temporarily. He wasn't going to hold up residence. And so this is also dealing with the bigger picture of what was going on with Judges. Is this is a spiritual immaturity that's being dealt with. Elimelech was not a fully matured Christian. I won't use Christian at the time. He wasn't fully matured in his faith if he was willing to step out and say, I'm going to go to Moab to get my food. I'm going to take my whole family, travel 100 miles outside of Bethlehem where God has made all of his promises. And what's even more amazing about that is some people try to place the time because it just says now in the days of Judges. Some people try to place it with Ehud, but the Bible doesn't give us anything about the specific judge other than we know that it's only been a generation. If you turn to Matthew chapter 1, since they inherited the promised land, we'll turn to Matthew chapter 1. This is where I really enjoy doing studies, where you can connect the dots through Scripture. If you look at Matthew chapter 1, it's going to give the lineage of Jesus Christ. And there's a few people that don't seem like they belong when you look at a standard Jewish record. But if you go to verse 5, it says, and Solomon begot Boaz of Rahab, and Boaz begot Obed of Ruth. Rahab sounds familiar. That was Jericho. So if Rahab had Boaz, and Boaz is going to encounter Ruth in this book, it's barely been any time since they took over. That story has not faded. They fully understand the importance of following God, and he still decided to step outside the bounds. It does not take long. I don't care if you've been saved for 5 minutes or 50 years. There's not a time where you're safe, where you can say, I can withstand this without God. I can get through this. Because it's going to creep in, and you're going to start to desire to fill that carnal need that you have. And you're going to start to head towards Moab. And it's going to get dangerous. And you're going to say, well, I'll just sojourn there for a little bit like Elimelech. I'm just going to step out for a little bit and go get that fulfillment that I need. And what does that look like? It looks like money. It looks like jobs. A lot of people looking for jobs. Success by the world's standards. You say, God, you know what? I have been saved. I have done the right thing. I'm going to go to heaven, and you haven't provided the things that I'm supposed to get. That's what I believe. The things that I should be getting as a God-given right from you, I'm not getting, so I'm going to step out and get it myself. And you say, well, I've never said that. You are in a sense if you say that. You say, you know what, I need to get this job because it's going to give me this money. I need to go out and do this to earn this because that's my God-given right to live as comfortably as I'm supposed to. And you know what, I'm not supposed to be hungry. I'm not supposed to be without health insurance. I'm not supposed to be all of these things. You say, it's my job to go out and get it because you didn't provide it, Lord. You didn't provide what I was supposed to get. And that's the attitude that starts to set in your mind when you say, I'm just going to sojourn for a bit. That's all I'm going to do. But as we continue down, we see in verse 2, though, that it ends in verse 2 and says, and they continued there. That's the problem. You're going to get comfortable in Moab real quick. Because your flesh likes instantaneous response. And when you go and you get that instant response, the Google generation that we're in, we like, that 0.001 seconds we have to wait is too long to get an answer. Or if we lag when we're trying to talk to our phones and it sits there and does the spinning thing, you curse all those who ever touched that phone and made it because it's not fast enough. We like instantaneous. I was entertained as well on that hike yesterday while Matt was trying to talk to his phone, and it was picking up everybody else talking in the car at the same time, and he's sitting there getting frustrated with it. And I thought, you know what, that's still really cool that a phone can do that. But look how easily we'll get frustrated with something like that. Now, he didn't get angry and throw it out, but I know I've had times where I sit there and I go, man, I just want it to do what I want it to right now. Right now. I don't want to wait. I want to, while I'm driving to McDonald's to get my food immediately, I want my phone to immediately do what I want it to do. So my paycheck can get immediately deposited in my bank account so I can immediately buy the stuff I immediately need. That's how life works now. That's exactly how it works, and we've gotten used to it. But they continued in Moab. That's where the danger is going to start to happen, is when you're sojourning. And now the danger is real once you continue. These are going to be people who are going to start to disappear from the ranks. We have people who are in this church that are no longer here. They're still in this community, but where are they? They got comfortable in Moab. They're somewhere else. What's your job? Bring them back. Ruth, we could talk all about her. But Ruth, in this story, she is a friend who refuses to give up and wants to be with Naomi. Those people need a friend. If you know someone who's in Moab, they don't need you to tell them they're in Moab and discipline them. They don't need that. They need you to tell them the love of God is still in Bethlehem. You need to go back. We're still here waiting for you. God's going to deliver everything he promised. You just need to wait through that season. That's all you needed to do. And so we'll look at an example. Turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 5, and you say, well, Elimelech was killed, and so are both of his sons. Surely God does not deal with his people in such a way. 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 5. Now Paul is dealing with a church that is extremely carnal. Extremely carnal. They're having all kinds of issues, even having incest. There's all these issues that are happening. And he's dealing with people who are dwelling full-time in Moab, who have accepted the Lord. They were in Bethlehem. They moved to Moab. The whole church did. And he's dealing with them right now. And he says in verse 5, to deliver such a one unto Satan for the destruction of the flesh, that the spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord Jesus. Your body is temporary residence for a soul. It was said this morning, I think, during Brother Butler's message. He said, your body is just a vessel for your soul. That's it. It's not the other way around. Your soul is taking up temporary residence in your body. Your body is worth nothing for the sake of salvation. Zero. In fact, it just gets you in trouble. And so God, when he is destroying what you say is your God-given right to have your body, and he destroys that for the sake of your soul, and death starts to set in, he's trying to remind you, it's the eternity that matters, not your body, not what you're feeding it, not what kind of clothes you're putting on it. It's the eternity that matters of the soul. And so God, yes, he will deal with a believer, because from his word that I read right there, he will deal with a believer in such a way that he will hand you over to have your body destroyed for the sake of your soul. And does that mean to be saved and go to heaven? No. That means to keep you from doing any more harm to yourself or those around you. So we're going to turn here to 1 Timothy chapter 1. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 18 through 20. We're going to look at two men who this happened to. And again, he's writing to Timothy. This is a pastoral epistle, as they're called. He's writing to Timothy, telling him how to deal with this. There's a problem of carnality. There's a problem where two men, as he's going to say, have shipwrecked from the faith. This charge I commit unto thee, son Timothy, according to the prophecies which went before on thee, that thou might, by them mightest war a good warfare. He's telling them this is a fight. It's actually a war. We know that this is a spiritual warfare that we fight. It has nothing to do with flesh and blood. It's a spiritual warfare. Holding faith and a good conscience, with some having put away concerning faith, have made shipwreck. So this is someone who has the faith, but they've shipwrecked. The boat went off course and is having problems. In verse 20, of whom is Hymenaeus and Alexander, who are elaborated on in 2 Timothy as to what they did, whom I have delivered unto Satan, that they may learn not to blaspheme. In order to be handed over to Satan, you had to be God's. You're being given back for the sake of having your body torn down until you behave and listen. It's the same thing we do with a child when we spank them. What are we spanking? We hitting the soul? No, you're hitting the flesh. You're hitting the flesh to wake up, to pay attention. Proverbs tells us even a fool will respond to pain. You will wake up. And when God is dealing with you and you say, you know what, it's unfair. It's not what I deserve. You know what? It's not fair what Christ had to do on the cross to have you go to heaven. That's not fair at all. That was mercy. It has nothing to do with fairness. And when he's dealing with you, what you're getting for a short time period is exactly what you needed and what you deserve. It was a chastisement to bring you back in. Because Elimelech, as you're going to see, is called right back. Elimelech's family is called right back out of Moab. His wife Naomi, with her two daughters-in-law, are called back out of Moab because the chastisement was continuing. So we're going to turn back to Ruth. So we know we're dealing with a physical suffering right now. But Naomi is dealing with much more than that now. So Elimelech may have been physically suffering and died. Her sons may have been physically suffering and died. But Naomi is dealing with so much more. Naomi now is dealing with all four. She's mentally suffering right now. She's in anguish because her family is dying. She has physical suffering. She's still under famine now. She is a widow who cannot feed herself. She's going to starve. Emotional is stressful. In Moab, there's no laws, there's no Levitical laws that hold her from dying. There's nothing. She has no family that's going to provide for her. She left the place where those promises were. In spiritual suffering, she's pulled herself far from God, far away. And so when you start out with one kind of suffering, it quickly will elevate and become 2, 3, 4 kinds of suffering that you're going to have in your life. And it's just going to get worse and worse until you respond. You have to understand that when you are God's, before you were God's, you didn't worry about offending him. He didn't worry about chastising you for the sake of correcting you. You weren't his. But now that you're his, he's very much worried about chastising you and correcting you. He's very much worried about taking you in and spanking you so that you wake up and pay attention. And I've told my son this before, and when he was getting ready to turn 12, we started doing a study about manhood. And I told him, I said, Lennon, you need to listen. I said, when you're a child, I spank you. When you're a child, I spank you. And of course, at 12, I've tried to minimize that as much as possible because he needs to learn to listen to God. And I said, I spank you. But I said, I want to warn you. I said, when God spanks you and disciplines you, I said, it is grieving more than you've had before. I said, and as a man, he's going to deal with you as a man, and it's going to get hard on you. And it was really neat to watch because he probably doesn't like that I share this, that he started having that in his life recently, where he said he came down and he was stressed. And I said, what's wrong? And he said, Dad, I just don't feel good about stuff. I think it's kind of what he said. I don't feel good about stuff. And I said, Lennon, that's because you spent all day essentially in Moab. I didn't say that this time. You spent all day dwelling around in Moab looking for ways to please yourself. Then at night, when you lay down, you're realizing it was a waste. And God's going to deal with you because he's going to let you roll around in that for a while until you remember every day that you need to stay with him and stay in his word. And so whether you're going to sojourn or stay, that's going to be the first thing you need to remember. If you've been sojourning in Moab for some time, you've been serving yourself in the privileges you think you deserve, of course, carnally speaking, and through your job, through your social life, through the money you've been making. You want to take more comfort in the enemy's camp than in this house with God's people. Then remember that sojourning is going to lead to you continuing. And if you run into someone who has been like that and say, I've been strong, remember, they need somebody to draw them back. They need a Ruth to be a good friend to say, I'll go back with you. I'll help you out and stick with you. And so we're going to look at the second 2 words there. So that was sojourn and continued. We're going to look at the second 2 words that I told you were important. And those are going to be Mara and harvest. So we're going to look at verse 20. We're going to go there. Because just to summarize what had happened is that Naomi now has lost her husband and her 2 sons, and she heard in Moab that the Lord was providing in Bethlehem. The house of bread is providing bread. Not a shock, because God said he was going to do it. It's not a shock. And so Naomi's going to head back. And when she heads back with Ruth, the people in the city remember who she is, and they're excited to have her back. That's the attitude we should have when somebody returns. We should say, welcome back. Don't pry and prod as to their details of what happened. They just came back. That's all you need to know. Let the pastor, let a deacon, someone they go to address it, talk to them. But all you need to do is just give them a hug and tell them welcome back. That's what they need. They need to feel more loved here than at Moab, because that was a problem to start with. That's why they started dwelling there. They've already made the journey. They just need you to love them. Now, looking at Naomi, Mara, she says in verse 20, and she came to them, call me not Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me. Mara, if you remember from Exodus, that was the bitter springs that they came across that did not taste good. Mara means bitter. And look at her attitude that happens here. Because as you come back, what can happen is you may come back to the house of God. You may come back to where the bread is from God, but you may not have the attitude that is still needed. Because look at what she says at the end of verse 20. For the Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me. And then into verse 21. I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me home again empty. She has that backwards. What she's still thinking is, carnally, I'm empty right now. I'm completely empty. No, no, the Lord cleaned out filth from your life, and now you're ready to be filled. That's the way you need to think about it. When you go into a house that belongs to one of those hoarders and they have things all up the walls, and they use the restroom in the corner because they can't even access their bathroom, and there's mice and there's animals and there's always hundreds of cats for some reason. But when you go into one of those houses and somebody comes in and redoes everything and cleans it out and sends it all to the junkyard and repaints the walls and does the carpet, when you come in, you don't say, this used to be full and now it's empty. No, now it's useful. And that's exactly what God was dealing with, but her attitude's backwards. She thinks that she's empty right now, as in she has nothing she needs. She's still thinking carnally, I don't have what I want right now. And so this is the mindset that somebody might have when they come back. That's why you have to be careful when they come back in. The first thing they don't need to fill is a negative response from one of the members. That's not needed. They just need that to get filled with love through God's people. And so she's backwards on that. So we continue. Why then call ye me Naomi, seeing that the Lord hath testified against me? There's an issue. And the Almighty hath afflicted me. She's right, she's afflicted. But he has not testified against her. He's not against her, he's testified for her. That's exactly why your parents spank you. They're testified for you. That's what they want you to grow up to do, the right things. They're not against you. You hear that, kids? I'm not against you. I'm not against you when I give you a spanking. I promise. I'm completely for you. But some of you might want to be more for your kids, but, not saying anything. You might want to testify more for your children. But and then feel free to let me know if I need to testify more for my kids. But Naomi has that wrong. He's against me. No, he's for you. And no, you're not emptied. You're now made useful. Your vessel's been emptied so you can be useful now. So you have to remember that when you come back, this is the mindset somebody could have. This is also your mindset. If you've ever been in this place, you can look back and say, I remember this. Because if you're here tonight, it could be your first night that you came back. You could have just journeyed back in these doors. Or you could be at the point of sojourning where this is still your thought that God is dealing with you. You were against me. I am now getting full on my terms. I'm warning you that Moab is not a place you want to dwell. You don't want to take up voting residence. And now Naomi also, as we look at the last word, we look at bitterness right there. So bitterness starts to set in. Bitterness is that hatred that you're going to start to build, and you're going to become bitter to the point that you are sour to everything God has to offer. You're going to become upset at anything he has. We had the visiting preacher here the other day, or last week, that said, when you've upset your children, you can start to see that bitterness start to build if you start to anger them too many times, and they're going to start to pull their hand away from you. They're going to start to pull their heart away from you. They're going to start pulling back from you. And as a believer, you can start to do that with God, where you start to pull back and you say, I don't like what you're offering anymore. It's not what I wanted. And that's where she's at. She's got that bitterness where she's back because she knows that the other option is death, but she's still not back with the right attitude. She still doesn't like what God's got to offer. And what happens when bitterness starts to set in is the last thing we looked at was, I said, you're going to look at the word harvest in verse 22. Because Naomi, and we look at it, it says, so Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, which returned out of the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of the barley harvest. Naomi was so bitter, she did not even see the blessings God was giving her. You'll become completely blind to the good things that God is providing, and you're going to miss out. And so while you're busy being focused on the bitterness that you have with what God has offered you, and what you think he has done against you, when in fact he's for you, that you're going to miss the blessings that he has sitting right in front of you. The harvest time was the greatest time to be there. When you talk about two widows coming back, the best time to be there was harvest time. Because later in the story you can read that they were gleaning in Boaz's field. Guess what other time of year you can glean? None. They came back right at the beginning of the harvest time to glean. The Lord's timing is always perfect. This is where you see that this is that subtle divine intervention that God constantly has in your life to move you, to help you. He's never testified against you. He's always for you. And when the suffering starts to set in, your reaction is what's going to matter most. Always, that's going to be what God is seeking. He's not worried about your belly being full. He's not worried about your bank account being big. He's not worried about you getting the job you want. He's not worried about whether or not the boat's got gas for John. He's not worried about whether you have the nicest vehicle on the block. What he's worried about is how are you going to react when it comes. I would love to be there talking about John. I'd love to be there and see how John acts when the axle breaks. I'm sure he is held together so much more than I ever could be. I'm not giving him any praise or anything or lifting him up, but his reaction to that, I would love to watch, because that's part of that suffering in your life that you really would want to see how he would behave and how he would react and look back on it and say, you know what? The axle broke on the truck in the middle of nowhere. I have no way to get out. How am I going to respond? I don't know how to do that. I can't imagine how it happens, because that's a need that you have. But how do you say, Lord, how are you going to help me with this? What are you going to do? And we have a story written that tells us right here in Ruth exactly how you can call upon God, and he's going to help you. Ruth and Naomi are getting a blessing, but Naomi's too blind to see it. If you get too bitter about the events of now, right now, you're not going to catch the blessing that's happening to you. And so there's a couple of tests that you can do to see if that you're on your way to Bethlehem or if you're in Bethlehem right now. And this is what was important to me, and why I was reading Ruth and studying Ruth was because right now, as I said, there's a lot of people looking for jobs. And right now this week, I was told that I have to decide, am I going to stay or go? I got my RIP 1 year out, and the military says, do you want to stay or do you want to go? And we had to pray about it, and we talked about it. And I told my wife, I said, I'm worried that I'm going to choose something that's leading me more towards Moab. Because when you look at that assignment list and you say, oh, Hawaii looks nice. That looks really nice. And then you look at Alaska in summer and you go, this is nice. And then your wife says, well, February is coming. And you're like, oh, I remember that. But yeah, but there's a lot of things like that. There's a lot of carnal decisions we can make where you say, it's just one assignment. It's only 3 years. Elimelech got 10 before he was killed, so I'm just saying 3, Lord. 3 in Hawaii. That's all I'm saying. But it takes time. It takes time. It's going to be one step that way, and then you're going to take another step that way, and another step that way. And then before I know it, I'm going to be very career-focused. I'm going to be very focused on the carnal needs, and it's going to become dangerous. And that's why I was studying Ruth, as I was fearing. I don't want to make a carnal decision about this whatsoever, Lord, at all. And the pastor, of course, gives great comfort when you ask him serious topics like this. And his advice, I don't mind sharing that I asked him, was that he said, if your desire is to please the Lord and you're not rebelling, then he's going to help you stay. He's going to help you be in Bethlehem. But if you're outright rebelling and you're saying, Lord, that's not what I wanted to go somewhere else and do something else and be with other people, then you're rebelling. And it seems obvious while you sit here in church, but the decisions come time after time after time in our lives where we have to make a split-second decision as to what you're going to do, A or B. Which one do you want? Think back. Which one's going to make me stay in Bethlehem? That's it. That's all I want to know. And I see it all the time at the VA, and I actually taught part of a message out of this at the VA one time, because the guys there, they come in the first week, then maybe the second week, then they disappear, and I don't see them again. They come in heartbroken. They come in discouraged. They come in because the suffering was too much, and they're looking for an answer. And so I'll give them answers, but it's God's answers. Those don't sound good all the time. And that some of them, about half will profess to be Christian and half usually will not. But they'll say, that sounds really good. That sounds really good. They'll come a second week. Oh, yes, I want to get better. It sounds really good. But then the third week, gone. Why? I had to think about this. It bothered me for a while. What am I doing that makes these people hate me after 2 weeks? It's always 2 weeks. The second time I talk to them, they disappear. And then I realized that, it has nothing to do with me personally. It's that Moab just looked better. That was it. They started getting the comforts of life. They started getting food, shelter, clothing, money. Some of them get a car. And sometimes what's even scary is your family. You say, oh, surely the Lord won't use my own family against me. Well, if they're not saved, they're not under his influence. And so they start to get drawn to those things where they get comfortable again, and Moab sounds tempting. And so they go back to it. And this is where I like to look at it. There's a point where Christians and the world start to get close enough together that it starts to turn gray a bit. And if you can't be distinguished, then you're starting to be in Moab a lot. And so what's it look like? On this side is what I like to call practical atheism. These are going to be the folks who, they're in sin all the time, but they once in a while will listen to a Bible verse or show up to church for the sake of feeling better about their immoral decisions. Then they'll disappear. That's the 2-week crowd. But then there's impractical Christianity, which ventures very close to that. Impractical Christianity is where you come to church for the sake of wanting to stay in sin. You're desiring to. You say, well, those sound very similar. Yeah, they are. They're very similar. And it's very gray. And when you start to look just like the enemy, because you're standing there looking at them face to face, and you say, we look very similar. We dress the same, we act the same, we go to the same places, and I'm very comfortable on your side of the fence, you're staying. And that's when you're going to start to disappear from the church. That's when you're going to start to disappear from anything that gives accountability. And so tonight I just want you to think about that as you look into the book of Ruth, the subtle divine nature that God uses in each one of our lives is very real. And as you have that next big decision that you need to make, I'm not sure if any of you have one. And like I said, this is what led me to studying this, is that if you have a decision you need to make, think back to Elimelech. It took 10 years to receive the chastisement he was going to receive. There is long-term effects that it has every time you make a decision. But is it the decision, or is it your behavior towards God that he's wanting? It's always your behavior towards God, and he will help you out. Just remember that every time you make a choice. All right, Brother Mitch, I'll invite you up.